There's a moment, most people have had one, even if they've never said it out loud, where you look at something broken and think, that's me. Not in the poetic way, not the way people write it in journals or say it at therapy. In the raw, embarrassing, middle-of-a-Tuesday way, where you're standing in a field or a parking lot or a kitchen that hasn't been cleaned in 2 weeks and something, an animal, a photograph, a stranger's face, just cracks you open. This is a story about a man named Dillon Marsh, a rancher, former rodeo circuit, 43 years old and living alone on 40 acres of land that had been in his family for 3 generations. He found a donkey abandoned on the side of a county road in the middle of July. The donkey was tied to a fence post with baling twine, ribs showing, one ear bent sideways from an old injury that had healed wrong. Most people drove past. Dillon stopped. What happened after that, across the next 11 months, didn't just change his land or his routine. It changed the way he understood what loyalty actually looks like, what it costs, what it's worth. I'm going to tell you this story the way it was told to me, slowly, honestly, and without skipping the parts that hurt. Because the parts that hurt are the only reason the rest of it means anything. The stubborn thing wouldn't even look at me. I have a habit that most people find strange, and I've long since stopped apologizing for it. I keep a log. Not a diary. I want to be clear about that distinction because the word diary makes my neighbor Earl give me a look I don't particularly enjoy. A log. A working rancher's field log, the kind my grandfather kept in composition notebooks stacked in the barn office, notes scrawled in pencil about weather and cattle weights and fence repairs, and the one time in 1974 a mountain lion came down off the ridge and killed 2 of his best breeding ewes. Factual. Practical. The emotional content kept strictly to observable behavior. Except that it doesn't always work out that way. July 14th, Tuesday, I wrote stopped on CR 9 southbound, donkey on fence line, no brand, no owner visible, animal in poor condition, brought home. Reason unclear. That last part, reason, unclear, I stared at for a long time before I wrote it. Because the honest version would have been, reason, I recognized something in the way it was standing. But I didn't write that. I'm a 53-year-old man and I write field logs, not diary entries, and I drew a firm line at sentimental observations about donkeys. Let me back up. The summer of that year had been the worst dry spell in the county since 2012. I know this not because I'm particularly attentive to climate statistics, but because my well pump had been working overtime since May, my pasture grass was coming in brown and sparse, and 3 of my 7 cattle had developed a persistent cough that my vet, Dr. Anita Flores, attributed to dust inhalation and general misery. Her words, not mine. Anita has a gift for diagnosis that includes the emotional state of the animal. I was running the place alone, had been for going on 4 years. That's not a complaint. I want to say that clearly because people have a tendency, when they learn you live alone on a ranch, to assign a narrative to it, loss, loneliness, some great wound you're nursing. Sometimes that's true. In my case, it was partly true and partly just circumstance. The way things go when a marriage ends not in catastrophe, but in a slow, mutual acknowledgement that you've become strangers who share a property deed. Sandra left in February 4 years prior. We still talk on the phone occasionally. There's no bitterness in it, just the particular sadness of something that was real for a long time and then wasn't. I had the cattle, I had the 40 acres, I had my logs. I was managing. The morning I found the donkey, I hadn't slept well. I rarely do in July. The heat doesn't break until nearly midnight and then comes back hard around 4 in the morning, and I've developed the insomniac's talent for lying awake cataloging every noise the house makes. I was driving the county road at 6:15 a.m., headed to the feed store in Marlow before the day got too hot to think when I saw it. It wasn't dramatic. That's the thing about moments that end up mattering, they almost never announce themselves. The donkey was standing on the shoulder of the road, tied to the middle post of a wire fence, head down. It was a Jenny, a female, I registered that automatically, gray with a darker stripe running down her spine and across her shoulders in the cross pattern they carry, the one people have been assigning religious significance to for centuries. She was thin, not in the acute crisis way, but in the chronic way that's actually worse, the kind of thinness that comes from sustained deprivation, where the body has made its accommodations and the animal has simply stopped expecting better. She wasn't calling out, that's what got me. A distressed animal calls out. A horse in trouble will whinny. Even cattle will bellow when they're afraid or separated. This donkey was standing in the July heat on the shoulder of a county road, making no sound at all. She'd been tied there long enough that her feet had churned the gravel beneath her into a small depression. I drove past. I want to own that. I drove past, and I made it about 100 yards before I put the truck in park on the shoulder and sat there for a full minute. I am not by nature an impulsive man. My grandfather used to say that the Marsh men think twice and act once, and he meant it as a compliment, though it can read as obstinacy in certain situations. I had a list. I had a schedule. I had 3 coughing cattle at home and a well pump making an intermittent noise I didn't like and a fence on the northeast corner that needed resetting before fall. I did not need a donkey. I sat in the truck for 60 seconds, then I turned around. She didn't look at me when I walked up. That was the first thing I noticed and the first thing I wrote in the log later, though I struggled to articulate why it struck me so hard. Most animals, when a human approaches, will at least orient toward you. Prey animals especially, their survival instinct is to track potential threats. This donkey stood with her head down and her eyes forward, staring at a middle distance that contained nothing, as if she had conducted a very thorough assessment of the world's offerings and found them not worth the energy of attention. I've been around animals my whole life. I know the difference between calm and shut down. She was shut down. I stood about 8 feet away and just looked at her for a while. The baling twine around her neck was knotted twice, and it was tight enough that I could see where it had been rubbing. The ear that bent sideways, the left one, had a thickened scar at the base where something had healed badly, an old injury, probably a year or more prior. Her hooves were overgrown, the front right one curling at the toe in a way that had to be uncomfortable to walk on. She had a shallow cut on her right flank, dried over, a few days old at least. She was maybe 8 years old, maybe 12. Hard to tell in that condition. I said out loud to no one in particular, "Well." She didn't react. I untied the twine, had to work at the knots. They'd been done by someone in a hurry or someone who didn't plan on coming back. And I clipped a lead rope from the back of the truck onto a makeshift loop around her neck and walked her to the trailer. She went. She didn't resist, didn't balk, didn't call out. She walked with her head down and her eyes on the ground 3 feet ahead of her, putting one hoof in front of the other with the mechanical compliance of an animal that has learned that resistance costs more than surrender. That got into me somewhere I didn't have a name for. I loaded her, drove home, skipped the feed store. The first week was an exercise in patience that I was not certain I possessed. I put her in the small paddock adjoining the barn, the one I use for recovering animals or new arrivals who need quarantine. Good fence, good shade from the old cottonwood on the east side, a stock tank I cleaned out and filled fresh. I gave her a flake of good grass hay and stepped back. She ate, not eagerly, methodically, like she was doing it because her body required it, not because she wanted to. Anita came out the following day and did a full workup. The verdict was, malnourished but not critical, feet in need of a farrier immediately, possible mild respiratory irritation from dust, and the ear injury was old and stable. No brand, no microchip, no way to trace ownership. How long was she on that fence? Anita asked. I don't know. Long enough to wear a hole in the gravel. Anita made a face. She's in her late 40s, compact and efficient with the quality of emotional containment that comes from years of treating animals that can't tell you what's wrong. She's not going to be easy, she said. Animals that have been left like that, they don't just bounce back because you're being kind now. They've made adjustments. She's going to need time. I've got time, I said. Anita looked at me with something I recognized as mild skepticism. You've got 3 coughing cattle, a fence issue, and you're doing this by yourself, Dillon. I've got time, I said again. Her name came to me on the 3rd day. I hadn't planned on naming her. That sounds heartless, but it was practical. I didn't know yet if she would stay, if someone would claim her, if the situation was temporary. Naming things has a cost. You name something and you've made a commitment the animal can't even be aware of, but you feel it. I was filling her water tank on the 3rd morning, and she was standing in the corner of the paddock in her usual posture, head slightly down, weight shifted back, present in the body but absent in the eyes, and I said, just to fill the silence, "What's your name, then?" She turned her head and looked at me. Just for a second, maybe 3 seconds, then she looked away. But in those 3 seconds, something crossed her face that I have thought about many times since and still can't fully describe. Not hope, not quite. More like the faint memory of hope. The way a light comes on in a window of a house you thought was empty. I said, Rue. I don't know where it came from. I didn't plan it. It just arrived. She didn't react to it, but I wrote it in the log that night, donkey named Rue. Reason, see above. And under that, after a long pause, I added, she looked at me. The farrier came on day 5. His name was Bobby Cade, 28 years old, the best in the county, and he has the quality that the best farriers share with the best surgeons, which is that he talks the whole time he's working to distract both himself and his patient from what's happening. Rue was difficult with him. Not aggressive, she didn't bite or kick, but she kept pulling her feet back, which made the work slow and frustrating. Bobby was patient about it in the way you have to be patient with animals that don't trust you yet, which is a very specific kind of patience that requires you to check your ego at the door. He reset all 4 hooves over the course of 2 hours. Afterward, he stood and stretched his back and looked at her. She's been misused, he said. I know. Not just neglected, misused. He was looking at the scar on her left ear with the professional attention of someone reading a history. Someone's been rough with her for a while. That ear didn't get that way from one incident. I didn't say anything. She'll come around, Bobby said. They always do, the ones that aren't too broken, but you've got to be steady with her. Same time every day, same voice, same pace, no surprises. She needs to learn that you're predictable before she can decide you're safe. I thought about that for a long time after he left. Predictable before safe. I wrote it in the log. I kept coming back to it. I should say, a person who has been described at various points in my life as reliable, difficult, self-contained, hard to read, and my personal favorite from Sandra, delivered not unkindly, like a house that's been boarded up so long nobody remembers what's inside. I don't dispute any of these characterizations. I know what I am. I grew up in a household where emotion was expressed through action. You showed up, you did the work, you didn't make a fuss. My father was not a cold man, but he was a quiet one, and I learned the language he spoke, which is a language of doing rather than saying. The result is that I am useful in a crisis and opaque in ordinary life, and people who want to know me have to be willing to learn a different language. Sandra tried for 11 years. I think I tried too, in the way I knew how. But there are limits to what effort can accomplish when the underlying vocabulary doesn't translate. I thought about this, alone in the evenings on the porch while the heat finally let go of the day, listening to Rue moving in the paddock. The soft percussion of her hooves. Occasionally, in the first couple of weeks, a low sound she'd make, not a bray, but a kind of humming exhalation. I wrote, Rue made noise. Not calling out, more like thinking aloud. I understood that. The first real break came on day 12. I came out at the usual time, 6:45 a.m., always 6:45, Bobby's advice taken seriously, and Rue was standing at the paddock fence near the gate. Not at the far corner, at the gate, watching me come across the yard. I stopped. My heart did something embarrassing. I kept walking at the same pace. Same voice when I said good morning to her. Same movements filling her hay and checking her water. But when I was done and turned to go, she was standing right behind me. Closer than she'd ever been, close enough that I could feel the warmth coming off her. I didn't move. She put her nose very slowly, with the tentative quality of an animal that has learned to expect punishment for showing interest, against my shoulder. Held it there for maybe 4 seconds. Then walked away. I stood in that paddock for a while afterward, facing the fence, not writing anything in the log, not doing anything. Just standing there with one hand pressed against my shoulder where her nose had been, like I was trying to hold the warmth in place. I am 53 years old. I've been around animals my whole life. I've never had a moment quite like that one. I eventually wrote in the log, day 12. Rue initiated contact, unprompted, and then I sat with the pen in my hand for a while and added, I think she's decided I'm predictable. And below that, after a very long pause, the kind that comes before you write something true that you've been avoiding. I think I might be, finally, getting the hang of it. By the end of the first month, she had moved from the paddock into the main pasture area where she had more room, and something in her was opening up in a way that was gradual enough that you could miss it day to day, but was undeniable when you looked back over the log entries. The entries went from head down, minimal movement, ate mechanically, to moving around the pasture perimeter, alert to sounds from the road. Watched Bobby's truck come up the driveway for 15 minutes. 2, she found the brushy corner by the east fence and seems to like it in the afternoon. Started calling out this morning when I came late. That last one, calling out when I came late. I'd overslept by 20 minutes, July heat, bad night, finally went under hard around 4 a.m. and didn't surface until past 7. When I came out, she was standing at the inner fence calling, not in distress. In the particular register of a donkey saying, "You are late and I have opinions about this." I laughed. I wrote, "Rue has opinions, and I was late, I won't be again." I wasn't. The cattle got better. The well pump issue turned out to be a worn pressure switch, $40 fix, took me 20 minutes. The northeast fence got reset. The ordinary work of the ranch continued in the ordinary way, and Rue moved through it like she was learning the rhythms of the place alongside me, appearing at the fence when I was working near the barn, following the fence line parallel to wherever I walked in the pasture, standing very still and alert when she heard something on the road that she didn't recognize. She had, I realized around the end of August, appointed herself to something. I don't know what word to use. Guard isn't quite right. Companion isn't quite right either, though it's closer. It was more like she had decided that the scope of her attention included me, that my comings and goings were within the territory of things she tracked and cared about. Bobby came back for a follow-up on her hooves, and when he got out of his truck, she made a sound I hadn't heard before, a short, sharp exhale, a donkey's version of a warning sound. Not aggressive, informational. Bobby heard it and grinned. "She's watching out for you," he said. "I know," I said. "Donkeys do that," he said. "They're not like horses. Horses bond wide, they like everyone, want everyone to like them. Donkeys bond narrow, they pick someone and that's their person." I looked at her, she was looking at me. "She picked you," Bobby said. "Congratulations." I wrote in the log that night, "Bobby says she picked me. I don't know how that's possible given the circumstances of our first meeting. She was abandoned. I was convenient. But I'm not sure convenience explains the thing she does when she hears my boots on the steps in the morning." And then the sentence I had to sit with for a while before I wrote it. I wonder if she knows the difference. September came in dry, and then broke open in the third week with 3 days of hard, necessary rain that turned the pasture green again in a way that felt almost extravagant after the summer. I stood on the porch the first evening of rain watching the land drink, and after a while I heard the soft thud of hooves on wet ground and looked out to see Rue standing in the open pasture, getting rained on, head up, ears forward. She was, I realized, looking at the same thing I was looking at. I don't know what she saw. I'm not the kind of person who attributes human thought to animals, who imagines I know what goes on in a mind that works on entirely different principles. But there was something in the way she was standing, present, alert, something in the posture that read as alive to this, that made me walk out into the rain and stand beside her. We stood there for a while. The rain came down on both of us. The land smelled the way dry land smells when it's finally getting what it needs. Eventually, she put her nose against my arm and left it there. I did not write in the log that night. Some things resist the notation. The thing about loyalty is it has a cost. October. The log entry for October 4th reads, "Rue has taken to greeting the cattle." And then, below it, with what I now recognize as the dry humor I occasionally permit myself in the log when something delights me, "The cattle are unsure how to receive this." She had been moved into the main pasture by then, sharing the space with my small herd, 7 Angus cross cows and 1 bull, a big patient animal named Confederacy who had never in his life caused me a problem, and whom I respected accordingly. The cattle had regarded Rue's arrival with the specific suspicion that cattle apply to anything new in their environment, which is a suspicion composed equally of alarm and an almost immediate loss of interest. Within 2 weeks, they had collectively decided she was part of the landscape and resumed their primary occupation of converting grass to body weight. Rue had other ideas. Donkeys, I was learning, are social in ways I hadn't expected. They're herd animals, yes, but they engage with other animals differently than horses do, more directly, more deliberately, more on their own terms. She moved through the cattle herd with a particular purposeful quality, as if conducting inspections. She had favorites. The smallest cow, A 3-year-old heifer I called Little June because she'd been born last June and had the distinction of being the smallest calf I'd ever raised, had become Rue's particular project. Rue would find her in the herd and stand beside her, and Little June had gone from skittish to calm about this over the course of about a week. I wrote, Rue has adopted Little June. Little June appears to accept the arrangement. And then I know how that feels. The trouble came in the second week of October, and it came the way trouble usually does out here, at night, from a direction you weren't watching. I'd been hearing coyotes more than usual that fall. They move in cycles, and the population had evidently had a good year, because from mid-September on I was hearing them most nights, sometimes close, sometimes far off on the ridge, the high chorus of them that sounds to people who didn't grow up with it like something out of a disaster movie, but that I'd long since habituated to as just part of the nighttime soundtrack. I was not, if I'm being honest, as alert to it as I should have been. I'd become comfortable. The ranch felt settled. Rue was doing well, the cattle were healthy after the hard summer, the fall work was going smoothly. I was asleep at 2 in the morning when Rue started braying. The bray of a donkey at full volume is a sound that requires no interpretation. It is not subtle. It carries. It is, in its own way, an alarm system that does not have a snooze button. I was out of bed and moving before I was fully conscious, that specific animal urgency that ranchers develop over years, the body trained to respond before the mind catches up. I grabbed the flashlight and the rifle, 30-06, lever action, my grandfather's, and went out. Rue was at the far corner of the pasture, near the east fence, braying in the direction of the dark beyond the fence line. The cattle had moved, consolidated, the way they do when they're frightened, a tight cluster on the far side of the pasture. Little June was in the middle of the cluster. I swept the flashlight along the fence line and caught the Ishin. 3 coyotes, maybe 4, the light doesn't hold them, they move, you count what you can. I fired 1 shot into the air. The Ishin disappeared. Rue kept braying for another 30 seconds, then stopped, stood at the fence watching the dark. She stayed there, I learned later, until nearly dawn. I could see her from the bedroom window when I gave up on sleep at 5 and watched the sun come up. She stood at that east fence, facing out for the rest of the night. I wrote in the log, Rue stood watch, 3 hours minimum. Did not leave the fence line. And then she knew before I did. After that, things shifted. I knew they had shifted even if I had trouble naming exactly what had changed, which is a familiar condition. I'm better at observing changes than I am at understanding them while they're happening. Rue's position in the pasture changed. She stopped ranging freely through it in the random way she'd had before. She began moving along the perimeter, particularly at dawn and dusk, the times predators move. She would stand on the high ground by the old cottonwood and watch. When the cattle moved, she moved with them, not in the herd exactly, but adjacent to it, an orbit. The cattle noticed. They didn't lean into her the way they'd lean on each other in the cold, but they began unconsciously orienting toward where she was. Little June, in particular, had developed the habit of staying within about 30 feet of Rue at all times. Anita came out in late October for the cattle's fall vaccinations and stood with me for a while watching Rue work the fence line. You know donkeys are used as guard animals, she said. I know that now, I said. Some ranchers put one in with sheep specifically because they'll run off coyotes. They're territorial and they bond with whatever they're responsible for. She's not responsible for anyone, I said. She just lives here. Anita gave me the look she gives me sometimes. The one that suggests she finds my interpretations of situations to be technically accurate but somewhat limited. Dillon, she said, she's responsible for every animal in that pasture, including you. I thought about arguing. I decided not to. November. The neighbor situation I had been trying to ignore came to a head. This requires some background. The land adjoining my east fence, 20 acres, formerly part of the old Halcombe property before it was subdivided and sold in pieces, had been purchased in the spring by a man named Gerald Purvis. Gerald was from Lubbock, mid-50s, the kind of man who buys rural land with the intention of rural lifestyle and then immediately begins having opinions about how rural people should manage their lives. He had built a house on his 20 acres over the summer and had acquired, for reasons I was unable to determine, 6 horses. Gerald did not, as far as I could tell, know a great deal about horses. What he knew about ranching in general appeared to come from sources I would describe as aspirational rather than practical. He was not a bad person. I want to be fair about this. He was enthusiastic and well-intentioned, and he had ideas about his property that were entirely his business. He also had a section of fence along our shared east boundary that was, by November, in a condition I can only describe as theoretical. It suggested the idea of a fence. It did not perform the function. I had spoken to him about it in September, politely. He had agreed that it needed work and had not done the work. I had spoken to him again in October. He had agreed again. The fence had not changed. In the third week of November, 3 of his horses got through. I found them at 6 in the morning, 2 mares and a gelding, rangy and clearly not used to open pasture, moving fast through my cattle, scattering them in a way that stressed the herd and potentially, if sustained, could result in injury or miscarriage in the 2 cows I had that were bred. I moved them back through the gap in the fence, patched it with the emergency wire I keep for exactly this reason, and called Gerald. He was apologetic. He came over, looked at the fence, agreed it was bad, said he'd have someone out that week. That week came and went. I want to be clear that I am not a confrontational person. I find confrontation expensive in ways that have nothing to do with money. I keep my own counsel, I handle my own problems, I try very hard not to impose my difficulties on other people. This is, Sandra would tell you, both a virtue and a fault. But I also keep a log, and in the log, facts accumulate. The facts, the fence had been a problem since October. Gerald had been told twice. The horses had gotten through once and would get through again. My cattle were stressed. And Rue, and here's where the log entries begin to diverge from the purely factual. Rue had positioned herself on the east side of the pasture near the patched gap, and was standing there with the focused stillness of an animal that has identified a problem and intends to monitor it. On December 2nd, Gerald's horses got through again. This time, Rue was there. I was in the barn when I heard it, a brief, chaotic commotion from the east pasture, the sound of hooves on frozen ground, a short, sharp bray. I came out at a run and found this. Rue positioned between my cattle and the gap in the fence, facing Gerald's horses. The horses, the 2 mares, and the gelding, the same 3 as before, were not coming any further. Rue was not charging them, not being aggressive in any way I would call dangerous. But she had placed herself in a line, and she was making the sound she makes when she's serious, that low, repeated exhalation, firm and unhurried, and she was not moving. The horses didn't know what to do with her. Horses and donkeys have a complicated relationship. Donkeys lack the flight response that dominates horse behavior, and this absence is unsettling to horses in a way that's hard to describe without sounding like I'm overanalyzing it. The gelding made one movement toward her, and she stamped once and held her ground, and he stopped. I got them back through the fence. I repaired the gap again. I stood there for a while in the cold, breath-clouding, looking at Rue. She looked back at me. Then she walked away. I wrote Rue held the gap, and below it she didn't need me to tell her what to do. I went and talked to Gerald that afternoon. Not politely this time, not impolitely either, just directly. I laid out what was happening, what it was costing me in time and risk to my animals, what the legal situation was regarding livestock trespass in this county, and what I was going to do if the fence wasn't fixed by the end of the week. Gerald fixed the fence by Thursday. Afterwards, standing by my truck on his property, he looked across at my pasture and said, "Is that a donkey?" "Yes," I said. "Didn't know you had one. She's been here about 4 months." He watched her for a moment. She was standing near the repaired section of the east fence, which by this point I had begun to think of as her section. "She's something," he said, in a tone I recognized as the tone people use when they're not sure what they're responding to but feel the need to respond to it. "She is," I said. I drove home. The sun was going down in the west, burning the sky orange and red over the ridge, and Rue was a dark shape against it, standing at the fence, and I sat in the truck for a minute after I turned the engine off, just looking. December. My brother called. I should explain about my brother. Elliot is 50, 3 years younger than me, and he lives in Phoenix where he runs a medical practice and has a family, wife, 3 kids, a life that is constituted along entirely different principles than mine. We are close in the way people are close when they fundamentally understand each other despite having taken different roads. We talk on the phone once a month, usually for a long time, and when we talk it's the kind of conversation that requires no preamble because we both know the language. He called on the 15th of December and we talked for an hour and a half. At some point I told him about Rue, not the whole story. I don't tell the whole story of things easily by nature, but the shape of it. The county road in July, the baling twine. The way she'd gone from shutdown to sentinel. Elliot was quiet for a moment after I finished. Then he said, "How long has it been since you've had someone looking out for you?" I didn't answer right away. I'm not quick with emotional questions. I sat with it. "I've been managing fine," I said. "That's not what I asked," Elliot said. Another long pause. Outside the kitchen window, I could see the paddock light I leave on through the winter, a warm yellow square in the dark, and in its edge, Rue moving. "A while," I said. "Yeah," Elliot said, "just that." And then, with the understanding that characterizes the best conversations, he moved on to something else, and we talked about his kids and his practice and the weather in Phoenix, and I sat in the kitchen with the phone and watched the light in the paddock and thought about things I didn't say. The cold set in hard before Christmas. West Texas cold is different from what people imagine. It doesn't creep, it arrives, a front off the lawn of dropping temperatures 20 degrees in an afternoon. I had the barn opened up for shelter, water tanks with heaters, extra hay put out. Standard winter operation. Rue, to my initial concern, did not want to use the barn. I tried, the first real cold night, to move her in. She went in, stood in the large stall I'd prepared, looked at me and walked back out. I tried again. She walked out again. I stood in the barn aisle and looked at the empty stall and thought several things I won't put in the log. I consulted Anita in the morning. Anita, without even the faintest trace of surprise, told me that donkeys often prefer to be outside, that they're more cold-tolerant than horses due to their heritage in arid mountain environments, and that as long as she had access to a windbreak and good hay, she was probably fine. "She needs to see the pasture," Anita said. "She's not going to sleep in a closed stall when she thinks there's something to watch." I hung up and went back outside. Rue was at the east fence. The cattle were in the barn. She was standing in the cold, watching the dark. I brought her extra hay. I built a three-sided windbreak out of old lumber and corrugated tin on the east side of the barn, facing south, and put her hay there and a rubber bucket of water with a small heater in it, that she accepted. She slept in the windbreak most nights that winter, just outside the barn door, facing east. I wrote, Rue has redesigned the winter shelter situation to her specifications, and I have learned not to argue with her about this. Christmas Eve. Elliot and his family were in Phoenix. Sandra sent a card, she does, every year, and I always appreciate it, and we each understand that the card is the correct distance. I cooked a meal I had no real appetite for and ate it in the kitchen looking out at the dark. At some point I put on my coat and went outside. No reason, just the need for cold air and open sky that takes me sometimes, the rancher's impulse to check on things even when everything is fine. Rue heard me on the steps and made the low sound she makes when she knows it's me. I went out and stood with her in the windbreak out of the wind. It was clear and cold, the stars hard and bright, the ridge a black line against the sky. She stood beside me with her shoulder against my arm, not asking for anything, not performing anything, just there. I don't know how long we stood like that. Long enough for my hands to get cold and for the stars to shift a little in their arc across the sky. Long enough for the particular loneliness of that night to become something different, not gone, not healed, but accompanied. She turned her head and looked at me, the bent ear, the dark eye in the dark night. I put my hand against her face. She didn't pull away. I wrote in the log later, back in the warm kitchen, in the handwriting that gets looser late at night, Christmas Eve. Cold, clear, Rue was out. I went out. And then, after a long time with the pen in my hand, I think she's been doing this for me longer than I noticed. I think I've been needing it longer than I admitted. And the last line, which I almost didn't write but did, I don't know who I'd have become this year without her. What loyalty leaves behind. January has a particular quality in this part of Texas that I have spent my whole life failing to adequately describe. It's not the cold, though the cold is real. It's not the short days, though the days are short and the dark comes early and stays long. It's something more fundamental, a stripping down, a reduction, as if the landscape is doing what the livestock do in hard winters, which is to conserve, to go back to what's essential, to stop expending anything on the decorative or the elaborate. You see the bones of the land in January. The brushy draws and the creek bed rocks, and the old fence posts that have been there since before anyone living remembers putting them in. I find January, if I'm being truthful, clarifying. Log entries from January and February have a different quality than the earlier ones. Not more frequent. I'm not a man who becomes more verbose in proportion to internal activity. But the language changes. The observational distance I maintain in the log, the habit of writing rue did X at Y time for Z reason as if I'm a naturalist documenting a subspecies, that started to break down somewhere around mid-January, and what replaced it was less organized but more accurate. January 11th, she waited for me at the gate for 45 minutes this morning. I was doing the water tanks and ran long. When I came around the barn, she was standing at the gate looking in the direction she knows I come from. She looked relieved when she saw me. I know how that sounds. I am writing it anyway. The thing I hadn't told anyone, not Anita, not Bobby, not Elliot in our phone calls, was that I had been having a hard time of it in ways that had nothing to do with the ranch. Not a crisis. I want to be careful about the word. Not the kind of hard time that requires intervention or alarmed calls from family members. Just the accumulation of things, the solitude that had been fine for years and then one winter was less fine. The awareness, arriving with the clarity January specializes in, that I was 53 and that certain futures were closed to me now. The absence of Sandra not as grief exactly, but as the long arithmetic of what might have been. I slept badly. Some mornings it was hard to start. What got me out of bed reliably without fail every morning of that winter? Rue at 6:45. Not because I forced myself, not with the grim determination of someone doing the thing they're supposed to do, but because she was expecting me. Because she had worked out the schedule and integrated it into her own, and when I was late, she came to the fence and called, and when I was on time, she met me at the gate with her head high and her good ear forward. I wrote one morning, she doesn't know she's keeping me going, and then more quietly, the sentence below it, or maybe that's not what she's doing. Maybe what she's doing is just being a donkey. And what I'm doing is the thing I'd always be able to do if I had a reason that was immediate and present and looking at me with large, dark eyes. I've thought about that sentence a lot since. In February, Elliot came to visit. He'd never been to the ranch in winter. His trips are usually in spring or summer, better weather for the kids. He drove up alone this time, said he wanted to see how I was doing, and I knew from the way he said it that he had heard something in our December phone call that I hadn't intended to convey. He arrived on a Saturday morning, and the first thing he did, after coffee and a brief tour of the barn, was follow me out to the pasture. Rue came directly to me, which she always did, and stood beside me while I checked the cattle. Elliot watched her. "She's bigger than I expected," he said. "She's filled out," I said. "She was half this weight when I found her." He watched her follow me along the fence line, that orbit she kept, always in my peripheral vision, always knowing where I was. "She follows you." "She does." He was quiet for a while, then he said, "She loves you." I said with the reflexive deflection I'm trained to, "Animals don't." "Don't," Elliot said, not unkindly. "Don't do that." I didn't say anything. Rue was standing between me and the cold wind off the ridge, and I knew she wasn't doing it deliberately, knew it was probably just the pattern of her movement, but the fact of it was what it was. "She found something to take care of," Elliot said, "and so did you." March. Spring doesn't come gently on the lawn. It arrives in argument with winter, days swinging wildly between warm and cold, the ground wet and then frozen and then wet again, green pushing up through the gray-brown residue of the previous season. The cattle begin to move differently, more range, more energy, the winter torpor breaking. Rue moved differently too. She was ranging the full perimeter now, not just the east fence, doing long, slow circuits of the property that I came to think of as her rounds. Bobby came in March for her quarterly trim and said her feet were in the best condition they'd been since he'd first seen her. Her weight was good, her coat was coming in with the spring change. The scar on her ear had faded to something you had to look for. "She's a healthy donkey," Bobby said, with the satisfied tone of someone confirming a job well done. "Whatever you did right." "I showed up at the same time every day," I said. Bobby looked at me, then looked at Rue. "That'll do it," he said, "for donkeys and most other things." There was a crisis in April that I've thought about many times since in terms of what it revealed, about her and about me. It was a Saturday, mid-morning, and I was moving a section of old irrigation pipe from the east corner of the property to the barn for storage. Heavy work. Awkward. The kind of thing you shouldn't do alone because the pipe is long and unwieldy and requires you to commit your attention fully to what you're carrying and not to what's around you. What was around me, as it turned out, was a bull snake, a big one, maybe 5 feet, which is fine. Bull snakes are harmless and useful, but it had been sunning itself exactly where I stepped, and I went down hard on the uneven ground. The pipe caught my shoulder when I fell. I came down on my left knee on the rock. I lay there for a moment, did the assessment. Shoulder was sore but not gone, knee was bleeding but not broken, ego was the most significant casualty. Then Rue was there. I don't know how fast she crossed the pasture, fast enough that I hadn't finished my assessment when she arrived. She came around the end of the pipe, shoved her nose against my side, and stood there. I said out loud in pain to a donkey, "I'm okay." She didn't move. I sat up. She stood with her head over my shoulder, not bowing it, not pressing, just there, in the way that means we're staying until I decide otherwise. She made the low sound. "I'm okay," I said again. The bull snake had long since departed. My shoulder hurt. My knee was bleeding through my jeans. Rue was beside me with her ear forward and her dark eyes on my face. I put my hand on her neck, and she was warm and solid and present. I sat there for a while on the cold April ground, hand on her neck before I got up. The log entry from that evening reads in full, fell, east section. Bull snake, not serious. Rue came, sat with me, and then nothing else. Some things I've said I can't write. This was one of them. What I didn't write, that lying on the ground with my hand on her neck, was the first moment in longer than I could honestly calculate that I had felt, in a physical way, not alone. Not philosophically not alone, the kind that comes from knowing people exist in the world who care about you. The immediate, warm, breathing kind. I've spent a lot of my life not needing that, or telling myself I didn't need it, which is a different thing, and the difference had been getting harder to maintain. She came and got me. That's what I keep returning to. May, June. The ranch was running well. The cattle had gained good winter weight and were grazing well into the spring grass. I'd repaired the northeast fence properly, braced every 6th post, done it once for it to last. Gerald Purvis's fence had been reset in the spring and was holding. The well pump was fine. The log from May and June has something in it I didn't have before, reading back through it now, small notations about Rue that have no practical content. Not Rue did X for operational reason Y, but Rue spooked at a hawk on the east fence. Watched it for 20 minutes after it left. Rue let little June groom her today. First time. Rue and I sat outside until past dark. Good night. These entries would have been foreign to me 8 months prior. They wouldn't have occurred to me as worth writing down. Something about the project of recording her had changed what I considered worth recording. Something about her being there had changed what I considered worth noticing. Elliot called in June. We talked for a long time, and toward the end he asked how I was doing, genuinely the way he asks it, which is not a pleasantry but a question. I thought about it seriously before I answered, which I don't always do. "Better," I said. "Yeah." Differently than before. I don't know if better is the right word, just I'm paying more attention. "To what?" I looked out the kitchen window at the paddock where Rue was standing in the late light. The bent ear, the good ear, the cross on her back. "Things that matter," I said, "things I was letting go past." Elliot was quiet for a moment. "That sounds like better," he said. "Maybe," I said. "Yeah, maybe it is." July 14th. The log from that day reads, 1 year since CR9. Rue seems fine. She's standing in the east pasture, same as any day. I went out that morning with an extra handful of apple pieces. She developed a taste for them over the winter, not a passion. She approaches apples with a kind of measured dignity that suggests she finds enthusiasm undignified. But she likes them. And I stood at the fence and gave them to her one at a time from my palm, the way you do, the flat hand and the soft lips that take things very carefully and the warmth of her breath. She looked at me the whole time, dark eyes, the bent ear. The sun was already up and it was going to be another hot day, and the land smelled like summer grass and the warm, dry smell of the horses 2 pastures over and the clean animal smell of her. A year. I'd kept a log for the whole year. I have 47 entries about her. I've looked back through them, and they tell a story I would not have been able to narrate to you in July of last year because I didn't know yet what it was. I thought I was documenting the recovery of an abandoned animal. I was doing that. But I was also documenting something that was happening to me, in the way that things happen to you when you're paying attention to something other than yourself. You come in from the side sometimes, on the things you need. August. Bobby came for her quarterly trim, and we had the conversation I've been slowly building toward with him all year, the way you circle around a true thing, and he said, "You know what's interesting about donkeys as guard animals? The reason they're effective isn't that they're aggressive. It's not that they fight, it's that they don't leave." He was trimming her front left, her and him in the comfortable working rhythm they'd built over the year. "Most prey animals flee," he said. "Danger comes, they run, donkeys don't. Their response to a threat is to stand their ground and call out and stay between what they're protecting and what's coming at it. They're effective not because they're fierce, but because they're there. They don't abandon what they've claimed." He set her foot down and straightened. "She claimed you," he said. "She's not leaving." I thought about that for the rest of the day. I went back and looked at the log entry from July 14th of the previous year. Donkey named Rue. Reason, see above. And below it, she looked at me. I thought about what that had meant then. The light in the window of the house you thought was empty. The faint memory of something I hadn't known I was waiting for. She'd looked at me on day 3 after 2 days of not looking at anything. I'd read it as the beginning of trust, and it was. But I wonder now, I've been wondering since Bobby said what he said, what it was from her end. In that moment, what she was doing when she turned her head and looked. I wonder if she was doing the thing she does. Identifying what she'd claimed, taking note of it, deciding this one, I'm not leaving. She'd been abandoned, and I'd been not abandoned. That's not the word. That's not fair to Sandra, or to circumstances, or to the genuine mutual decision of 2 people who became strangers. But there are things you walk away from yourself that feel like being left, and there are winters when the house is very quiet, and there are moments on the county road where you drive past something broken and keep going. I turned around. She looked at me. Maybe we found each other at the right moment. Maybe these things don't happen because of readiness or planning or anything as clean as timing. Maybe you find the thing that claims you when you happen to be in the road where it's been left. Maybe that's enough. The log from last night, August 16th, reads, writing up the year, Rue on her rounds. Cattle doing well, weather breaking. And the last line, the one I'm going to leave because some endings resist the impulse to conclude. She just looked in the window. I could see her breath on the glass.